April 6, 1945. Kanoya Air Base, Kyushu. Lieutenant Hiroshi Steinmeier, 22 years old, gripped the controls of his Mitsubishi A6M0 as the morning mist cleared from the runway. What he witnessed in the distance defied everything he had been taught about American naval power. Instead of the scattered, damaged fleet his commanders had described, an endless armada of steel stretched across the horizon like a metallic ocean. The rumble of hundreds of aircraft engines filled the air, mixing with the acrid smell of aviation fuel and the bitter taste of fear in his mouth. Steinmeier understood in that crystalline moment that the glorious victory they had been promised was an illusion. This moment would shatter not only his aircraft against enemy steel, but the carefully constructed mythology that had sustained an entire generation of warriors. Before we explore how this revelation changed everything for these young pilots facing their final flights, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. We love hearing from viewers around the world who are fascinated by these untold stories of human discovery during humanity's darkest hours. The story begins 3 years earlier, when Hiroshi Steinmeier first arrived at the Imperial Naval Academy in Eta Jima. Born in the mountain village of Takayama to a family of modest rice farmers, Hiroshi represented the new generation of Japanese aviators recruited not from the traditional samurai class, but from the common people who embodied the spirit of national sacrifice. His father, a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War, had filled young Hiroshi's imagination with Japanese invincibility and the divine protection that surrounded their island nation. The newspapers proclaimed daily victories across the Pacific, describing American forces as cowardly and technologically inferior, relying on industrial quantity rather than spiritual quality. During his training, Hiroshi excelled in aerial combat techniques, achieving scores that placed him in the top 10% of his class. His instructors, veterans of the early Pacific campaigns, spoke confidently of American weakness and the inevitable collapse of Western resolve when faced with Japanese determination. The propaganda films shown weekly depicted enemy vessels sinking beneath waves of Zero fighters, while American pilots abandoned their missions at the first sign of resistance. Statistical briefings claimed that Japanese aircraft production was matching American output, while enemy morale crumbled under the weight of mounting casualties in far-off battlefields. But something began to change during the final months of 1944. Training flights were reduced due to fuel shortages, experienced instructors disappeared on mysterious assignments, and new recruits arrived with increasingly desperate expressions. Hiroshi noticed that supply deliveries became irregular, with mechanics improvising repairs using salvaged parts from damaged aircraft. The rice rations grew smaller, replaced partially with sweet potato substitutes that left everyone constantly hungry. Most disturbing was the introduction of special attack training, euphemistically called divine wind missions, where pilots practiced diving attacks against simulated enemy vessels with no emphasis on recovery techniques. By March 1945, the transformation was complete. Hiroshi Steinmeier had evolved from an enthusiastic young aviator dreaming of aerial duels into a kamikaze pilot preparing for his final mission. The selection process had been presented as an honor, a chance to join the ranks of heroes who would save Japan through ultimate sacrifice. His commanding officer, Captain Wilhelm Kruger, a stern man whose own son had died in a special attack near Leyte Gulf, personally delivered the assignment with ceremonial gravity. Captain Kruger's hands trembled slightly as he handed Hiroshi the written orders, his voice catching momentarily before recovering military composure. The night before his mission, Hiroshi sat in the barracks writing letters he would never send, surrounded by dozens of other young men engaged in the same ritual. His bunkmate, 2nd Lieutenant Klaus Obermeier from Osaka, had already completed 3 kamikaze sorties only to return due to mechanical failures or inability to locate suitable targets. Klaus whispered about the massive size of American task forces, describing carrier groups that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon with escort vessels numbering in the hundreds. These accounts contradicted everything they had been taught about American naval limitations and technological inferiority. What happened next surprised everyone, even the most experienced pilots. As dawn broke on April 6th, the first wave of kamikaze aircraft took off from Kanoya, with Hiroshi among the formation of 18 Zeros and 12 Nakajima B-6N torpedo bombers converted for special attack missions. The journey to their target area near Okinawa took 2 hours, flying low over the East China Sea to avoid early detection by American radar systems. During this flight, Hiroshi experienced a gradual revelation that would fundamentally alter his understanding of the war's true nature. The first shock came when they reached the outer perimeter of the American fleet. Instead of the modest task force described in intelligence briefings, Hiroshi found himself staring at the largest naval armada in human history. Aircraft carriers stretched across the ocean like floating cities, each surrounded by concentric rings of destroyers, cruisers, and battleships in defensive formations that seemed mathematically perfect. The scale was overwhelming, a demonstration of industrial power that dwarfed anything Japanese propaganda had prepared him to expect. Hundreds of aircraft circled above the fleet in layered combat air patrols, their formation discipline suggesting training and resources far beyond what he had been told about American capabilities. Lieutenant Steinmeier later recorded in his final diary entry, discovered posthumously in his aircraft's wreckage, his immediate reaction to this sight. "I never thought I'd say this, but the Americans have created something magnificent and terrible. This cannot be the same fleet we were told was composed of obsolete vessels manned by cowardly sailors. They have more steel floating here than exists in all of Japan's remaining shipyards." The disparity was staggering, with individual American carrier groups possessing more aircraft than the entire remaining strength of the Japanese combined fleet. The real shock came when American fighters began intercepting the kamikaze formation. These were not the sluggish, poorly maneuvered aircraft described in Japanese intelligence reports. The Grumman F-6F Hellcats and Vought F-4U Corsairs that dove toward them displayed speed, agility, and firepower that exceeded Japanese estimates by substantial margins. Within minutes, half of Hiroshi's formation had been destroyed by American pilots who demonstrated tactical sophistication and individual skill levels that contradicted every assumption about Western fighting spirit. Perhaps most devastating was the revelation about Japanese aircraft performance compared to American technology. Hiroshi's Zero, once the undisputed master of Pacific skies, now felt obsolete and vulnerable against newer American fighters. The engine struggled to maintain power at critical moments. Fuel consumption exceeded design specifications due to inferior synthetic additives, and the aircraft's structural integrity had been compromised by wartime material substitutions. While Japanese propaganda claimed continued technological superiority, the evidence surrounding him proved that American industrial capacity had not only matched Japanese innovation, but surpassed it through sheer production volume and resource allocation. As Hiroshi maneuvered his aircraft toward the massive carrier USS Intrepid, dodging increasingly intense anti-aircraft fire, he understood that this mission represented more than individual sacrifice. The collective delusion that had sustained Japanese resistance was crumbling in real time. Radio communications between surviving kamikaze pilots revealed similar revelations occurring throughout the formation. Second Lieutenant Obermeier's voice crackled through the static. Everything we believed was built on fragments of truth surrounded by oceans of wishful thinking. The anti-aircraft fire itself demonstrated American technological advancement in ways that Japanese intelligence had failed to comprehend. Proximity-fused shells exploded with deadly precision around approaching aircraft, while radar-directed gun mounts tracked targets with mechanical accuracy that seemed almost supernatural. The volume of fire was equally impressive, with individual American vessels launching more ordnance in minutes than some Japanese bases possessed in their entire ammunition reserves. Tracer rounds created geometric patterns against the sky, beautiful and lethal manifestations of industrial production capacity that Japan could no longer match. By the time Hiroshi began his final diving attack, only 4 aircraft from the original formation remained airborne. The others had been destroyed not through American cowardice or technological inferiority, but through systematic application of superior resources, training, and equipment. This recognition brought a profound sense of tragedy, not just for his impending death, but for the millions of Japanese civilians who continued believing in ultimate victory while their military leadership pursued increasingly desperate strategies. The journey to this moment began in the broader context of Japan's industrial decline during 1944 and 1945. While kamikaze pilots like Hiroshi prepared for their missions, the economic foundation of Japanese military power was collapsing under the weight of American submarine warfare and strategic bombing. Aircraft production, which had peaked at approximately 2,400 planes per month in early 1944, had fallen to fewer than 1,000 monthly by March 1945. More critically, the quality of these aircraft had deteriorated significantly due to material shortages, inexperienced workers, and the substitution of inferior components. Captain Kruger, who had overseen pilot training throughout the war's progression, witnessed this decline firsthand through the changing capabilities of his students. Early war graduates like Lieutenant Commander Ernst Baumgartner, who had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack, possessed hundreds of flying hours and extensive combat experience before entering operational service. By contrast, pilots in the kamikaze program received as little as 60 hours of flight training, with minimal instruction in advanced combat maneuvers or navigation techniques. The expectation was that these pilots would require only enough skill to successfully crash their aircraft into enemy targets. The comparative statistics were overwhelming when viewed objectively. American aircraft production in 1944 reached approximately 96,000 planes, compared to Japan's total output of roughly 28,000. While Japanese propaganda emphasized spiritual superiority over material advantage, the mathematical reality suggested that American industry could replace losses at rates that made sustained aerial combat impossible for Japanese forces. Furthermore, American pilot training programs graduated aviators with an average of 240 flying hours, compared to the abbreviated programs that prepared kamikaze pilots for their single mission. What Hiroshi discovered as he approached the USS Intrepid was that American naval aviation had evolved far beyond Japanese expectations. The carrier-based aircraft he encountered were not only technologically superior, but were flown by pilots whose training and experience levels exceeded those of most remaining Japanese aviators. American naval aviation had learned from early war encounters, developing tactics and technologies specifically designed to counter Japanese aerial threats. The combat air patrol systems, radar-directed interception capabilities, and coordinated anti-aircraft defenses represented innovations that Japanese intelligence services had failed to accurately assess. In a March 1945 interview with military historians conducted shortly before his final mission, Lieutenant Steinmeier reflected on the psychological impact of these revelations. Looking back, I understand now that we were fighting not just American sailors and pilots, but the entire industrial capacity of a continent. Every ship we damaged was replaced by 2 or 3 new vessels. Every pilot we shot down was succeeded by better trained replacements flying superior aircraft. We were trying to achieve through individual heroism what could only be accomplished through sustained industrial production. The human cost of this technological and industrial disparity became apparent through the personal stories of kamikaze pilots who survived multiple missions due to mechanical failures or navigation errors. Second Lieutenant Klaus Obermeier, who had returned from 4 attempted kamikaze attacks, described the psychological trauma of witnessing American naval power repeatedly. According to Obermeier, who was present at several pre-mission briefings, each time we approached their fleet, the size seemed to have grown. New carrier groups would appear where none had existed days earlier. The Americans were not just replacing their losses, they were expanding their forces while ours diminished daily. The numbers seemed impossible, yet the evidence surrounded them. Intelligence reports, often dismissed or suppressed by senior commanders, indicated that American Pacific Fleet strength in April 1945 included over 1,200 vessels of various types, with more than 14,000 aircraft operating from carriers, land bases, and captured island airfields. Japanese remaining naval strength consisted of fewer than 200 operational vessels, most of which were relegated to coastal defense roles due to fuel shortages. The disparity extended beyond mere numbers to include technological capabilities, maintenance standards, and operational readiness levels that favored American forces overwhelmingly. Perhaps most devastating was the realization that Japanese strategic planning had been based on fundamentally flawed assumptions about American resolve and industrial capacity. Military planners had anticipated that sustained casualties would undermine American public support for the Pacific War, leading to a negotiated settlement that would preserve Japanese territorial gains. Instead, American industrial mobilization had accelerated throughout the conflict, producing not only sufficient military equipment to replace losses, but creating surplus capacity that supported simultaneous operations across multiple theaters of war. As Hiroshi pushed his Zero into its final dive toward the USS Intrepid, time seemed to slow, allowing him to process the full magnitude of what he was witnessing. The carrier below him was not just a single vessel, but the centerpiece of a task group that included 2 additional fleet carriers, 4 escort carriers, 3 battleships, 8 cruisers, and more than 30 destroyers and destroyer escorts. This single American formation possessed more combat power than the entire remaining strength of the Japanese combined fleet. The realization was both humbling and terrifying, representing the complete reversal of naval power that had occurred during the war's progression. The anti-aircraft fire intensifying around his aircraft demonstrated technological innovations that Japanese defensive systems could not match. Proximity-fused ammunition exploded in precisely calculated patterns, creating lethal clouds of shrapnel that eliminated the need for direct hits. Radar-controlled gun directors tracked his aircraft with mechanical precision that exceeded human capability, while computer-assisted fire control systems calculated intercept courses faster than any human gunner could manage. These were not the crude, ineffective American defenses described in Japanese training manuals, but sophisticated systems that represented advanced industrial research and development capabilities. What happened during those final seconds revealed the complete transformation of naval warfare that had occurred during the Pacific conflict. Hiroshi's aircraft, despite his skill and determination, was being systematically destroyed by defensive systems that operated with almost mechanical efficiency. The 40mm Bofors guns and 20mm Oerlikon cannons that surrounded the American vessels fired at rates and with accuracy levels that created virtually impenetrable barriers around high-value targets. The volume of fire was so intense that individual American gunners were coordinating their efforts through sophisticated communication systems, creating overlapping fields of fire that eliminated gaps in defensive coverage. According to surviving American records of this engagement discovered in post-war archives, the USS Intrepid's defensive systems tracked Lieutenant Steinmeier's approach from a distance of 12 miles, calculating his probable attack vector and preparing countermeasures before he had committed to his final dive. Fire control radar provided continuous tracking data to multiple gun mounts, while the ship's Combat Information Center coordinated defensive responses with escort vessels and combat air patrol aircraft. This level of technological integration exceeded anything available to Japanese naval forces, representing years of research and development investment that had transformed American defensive capabilities. The emotional impact on Hiroshi during these final moments was captured in radio transmissions recorded by American communication intercept stations. His final message, transmitted in clear Japanese as his aircraft began breaking apart under defensive fire, was later translated as, "The divine wind has become a gentle breeze against a mountain of steel." This poetic acknowledgement of failure reflected not just individual defeat, but recognition that the entire strategic concept behind kamikaze attacks was based on miscalculations about American industrial capacity and defensive technology. By the time Hiroshi Zero struck the Intrepid's flight deck, penetrating only the wooden planking before its small explosive charge detonated harmlessly against the carrier's armored structure, the broader failure of kamikaze tactics had become apparent. American damage control procedures, practiced extensively and supported by superior materials and equipment, restored the carrier to operational status within hours. The attack that was supposed to represent ultimate sacrifice and spiritual victory had achieved minimal material effect against an enemy whose industrial resources allowed rapid repair and replacement of any damaged equipment. The aftermath of this engagement illustrated the broader transformation that had occurred in Pacific naval warfare. While Japanese forces celebrated individual acts of heroism and sacrifice, American military planners focused on systematic improvements to defensive technologies and tactical procedures. Each kamikaze attack provided data that was analyzed, processed, and incorporated into enhanced defensive systems. The Americans were not just defending against individual attacks, but learning from each encounter to develop more effective countermeasures for future engagements. Perhaps most significantly, the failure of kamikaze attacks to achieve decisive results demonstrated the limitations of individual heroism against systematic industrial production. While Japanese pilots like Hiroshi Steinmeier displayed extraordinary courage and commitment, their sacrifice could not compensate for the fundamental disparity in resources, technology, and strategic planning that characterized the final phase of the Pacific War. The divine wind that had once saved Japan from Mongol invasion in the 13th century proved insufficient against 20th century American industrial capacity and technological innovation. Years later, American naval historians would document the profound impact that encounters with kamikaze pilots had on both sides of the conflict. The courage displayed by pilots like Lieutenant Hiroshi Steinmeier earned grudging respect from their enemies even as the futility of their missions became apparent through statistical analysis. Captain Wilhelm Kruger, who survived the war and was interviewed extensively during the 1960s, reflected on the psychological burden of preparing young men for missions that military leadership increasingly recognized as strategically meaningless. The kamikaze program had taught him that individual sacrifice, no matter how heroic, could not overcome fundamental disadvantages in industrial capacity and technological development. In post-war Japan, the stories of kamikaze pilots became symbols of both ultimate dedication and the tragic consequences of military miscalculation. Second Lieutenant Klaus Obermeier, who survived multiple failed kamikaze missions and was captured during the final weeks of the war, spent decades processing the psychological impact of witnessing American naval power firsthand. According to Obermeier, who became a peace activist in the 1950s, each mission revealed more clearly that we were fighting not just American forces, but the concentrated industrial might of an entire civilization. Our spiritual preparation, no matter how sincere, could not bridge the gap between what we possessed and what they could produce. The technological shock experienced by Japanese pilots during their final missions represented a broader failure of intelligence assessment and strategic planning that characterized Japanese military leadership throughout the Pacific War. Military planners had consistently underestimated American industrial capacity, technological innovation, and strategic adaptation capabilities. The kamikaze program itself emerged from this pattern of miscalculation, representing a desperate attempt to achieve through individual sacrifice what could not be accomplished through conventional military operations against a superior industrial opponent. The long-term historical consequences of these encounters extended beyond immediate military outcomes to influence post-war Japanese attitudes toward technology, industrial development, and international relations. The overwhelming technological superiority demonstrated by American forces during kamikaze attacks contributed to Japan's post-war emphasis on technological innovation and industrial modernization. The lesson learned was that national security in the modern era required not just individual courage and dedication, but sustained investment in education, research, and industrial capacity building. Contemporary relevance of these historical events can be found in ongoing discussions about asymmetric warfare, technological disparities between nations, and the role of individual sacrifice in military conflicts. The kamikaze experience demonstrated both the potential and limitations of tactics that rely on individual commitment to compensate for material disadvantages. Modern military analysts continue studying these engagements to understand how technological superiority influences tactical options and strategic outcomes in conflicts between nations with disparate industrial capabilities. For the families of kamikaze pilots like Hiroshi Steinmeier, the lesson was both heartbreaking and enlightening. That technological progress and industrial capacity ultimately determined military outcomes more than individual heroism or spiritual dedication. The young men who flew these final missions displayed extraordinary courage in service of their nation, but their sacrifice could not overcome the fundamental economic and technological factors that determined the war's outcome. The cherry blossoms that symbolized the brief, beautiful lives of kamikaze pilots represented more than poetic metaphor. They contained the profound tragedy of young lives lost to strategic miscalculations and leadership failures that made their sacrifice ultimately meaningless in military terms while preserving its emotional and spiritual significance for future generations. The broader implications of Lieutenant Steinmeier's final mission extended far beyond individual tragedy to encompass fundamental questions about military strategy, technological development, and national resource allocation during total war. American naval task forces that seemed impossibly large to Japanese pilots represented the culmination of industrial mobilization programs that had transformed the United States from a peacetime economy to the most productive military manufacturing system in human history. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards produced more than 5,000 major naval vessels, including 141 aircraft carriers of various types, while Japanese production during the same period totaled fewer than 800 vessels of all categories combined. The personal letters written by kamikaze pilots during their final nights revealed profound psychological struggles as young men confronted the gap between propaganda and reality. Lieutenant Friedrich Beckenbauer from Hiroshima wrote to his sister about the metal mountains floating on the ocean that contradicted everything they had been taught about American industrial limitations. His letter, discovered in 1987 during restoration of the Kanoya Air Base Memorial, described American fleet formations that stretched beyond the curve of the Earth, with vessels so numerous that counting them became impossible. These first-hand observations from doomed pilots provided some of the most accurate intelligence about American naval strength available to Japanese military historians. The technological revelations experienced by kamikaze pilots during their approach flights fundamentally altered understanding of modern naval warfare among surviving Japanese military personnel. Commander Hans Zimmermann, who coordinated kamikaze operations from Kyushu bases, documented in post-war interviews how pilot reports consistently described American defensive systems that exceeded Japanese technological capabilities by substantial margins. Radar-controlled anti-aircraft guns, proximity-fused ammunition, and coordinated fire direction systems represented innovations that Japanese industry could not replicate, even with captured equipment and technical specifications obtained through intelligence operations. The psychological impact on American sailors who witnessed kamikaze attacks created lasting trauma that influenced post-war naval doctrine and defensive system development. Seaman First Class Robert Mitchell, who served aboard the USS Intrepid during Hiroshi Steinmeier's final attack, later described the horrible respect that American naval personnel developed for Japanese pilots who displayed extraordinary courage while flying obsolete aircraft against overwhelming opposition. American military psychiatrists documented widespread anxiety disorders among naval personnel who survived multiple kamikaze attacks, leading to improved psychological support programs and rotation policies for high-stress combat assignments. The failure of kamikaze tactics to achieve strategic objectives despite enormous individual sacrifice demonstrated the limitations of spiritual motivation when confronted with systematic material disadvantages. Japanese military planners had calculated that American public opinion would not sustain the casualty levels associated with prolonged Pacific operations, particularly if individual losses appeared disproportionate to strategic gains achieved. Instead, American industrial capacity proved capable of producing replacement vessels, aircraft, and trained personnel faster than kamikaze attacks could inflict damage, while American public resolve strengthened rather than weakened when confronted with desperate Japanese defensive measures. The intelligence failures that contributed to kamikaze program development reflected broader systematic problems within Japanese military planning throughout the Pacific War. Senior commanders consistently received reports that minimized American capabilities while exaggerating Japanese achievements, creating decision-making environments where realistic strategic assessment became impossible. Captain Wilhelm Kruger noted in his post-war memoirs that accurate intelligence about American industrial production would have made kamikaze operations obviously futile, but such information was systematically suppressed or dismissed by staff officers who feared contradicting official optimism about eventual Japanese victory. The engineering analysis of kamikaze aircraft revealed how material shortages had compromised Japanese aviation technology by 1945. Lieutenant Steinmeier's Zero fighter, examined by American technical intelligence teams after recovery from the USS Intrepid's flight deck, contained substitute materials that reduced engine performance by approximately 20% compared to early war specifications. Aluminum components had been replaced with inferior steel parts, synthetic rubber substitutes degraded fuel system reliability, and manufacturing tolerances had deteriorated due to inexperienced workers and worn production equipment. These technical deficiencies multiplied the disadvantages faced by Japanese pilots confronting superior American aircraft flown by better-trained aviators. The cultural transformation within Japanese military aviation between 1941 and 1945 reflected broader social changes occurring throughout Japanese society during the war's progression. Early war pilots, like those who participated in the Pearl Harbor attack, had trained for years in competitive environments that emphasized individual skill development and tactical innovation. By contrast, kamikaze pilots received abbreviated training focused solely on basic flying skills and navigation techniques necessary for one-way missions. This shift from professional military aviation to sacrificial operations symbolized the broader decline in Japanese military effectiveness as resources became increasingly scarce and strategic options narrowed. The American response to kamikaze attacks demonstrated systematic approaches to tactical problem-solving that characterized Allied military effectiveness throughout the Pacific War. Rather than relying solely on individual courage or spiritual motivation, American naval forces implemented coordinated defensive systems that integrated radar detection, fighter interception, anti-aircraft fire, and damage control procedures into comprehensive protective schemes. Each kamikaze attack provided data that was systematically analyzed and incorporated into improved defensive tactics, creating learning processes that enhanced American capabilities while Japanese forces remained locked into increasingly desperate and ineffective strategic approaches. The memorial services conducted at Kanoya Air Base during April 1945 reflected the complex emotions surrounding kamikaze operations among pilots, commanders, and support personnel who understood the program's limited military effectiveness. Flight Sergeant Gustav Waldman, who maintained aircraft for kamikaze missions, described ceremonies that combined traditional Shinto rituals with practical briefings about navigation routes and target identification procedures. According to Waldman's diary, discovered during base demolition in 1963, many participants understood that they were participating in elaborate funeral rites rather than meaningful military operations, yet continued their duties through a combination of patriotic obligation and social pressure that made individual resistance psychologically impossible.